And we're recording. Sorry, back to you, Mark.
No worries. Yeah, so where was I? I was on a roll. Today, we have a great feature. Something a little bit unusual. We call it Little Mr. Prose Poems, a Russell Edson tribute with the readings and letters of letters and prose poems. And our featured readers today will include Nin Andrews, Cassandra Atherton, our co-host, Maxine Chernoff, Chard deNiord, Denise Duhamel, Jeff Friedman, Peter Johnson, who is the instigator, and Mary Concell, and Gian Lombardo. So welcome everybody, and this is going to be an amazing show. As we go, I will let you know what's going to be happening in future Lit Balms. But for the time being, I'm going to introduce my co-host Jonathan Penton, who founded unlikelystories.org, an electronic journal of literature and art, in 1998. And he's been lending his editorial and management assistance to many literary and artistic ventures such as Mad Hat Incorporated, the New Orleans Poetry Festival, Rigorous, and Big Bridge. In 2005, he founded Unlikely Books, which publishes 3 to 5 books of poetry a year. He's organized literary performances and performed himself across the United States. His poetry books are Last Chat from Virgin Press, Blood and Salsa and Painting Rust, Prosthetic Gods from New Sins Press, and Standards of Sedity from Litfest Press in 2016. And more recently, the free e-chapbook Backstories, which you can download from Jeffrey's Side, the Liverpudlians Argotist ebooks. Please.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. So as the regulars have heard me say many times, I'm not very prolific. So rather than read one of my own poems, most weeks I read something we've been working on recently at Unlikely Stories or Unlikely Books. Right now, I'd like to read you something that we haven't published yet. It's from an upcoming book called Getting Away with Everything by Vincenz and Christopher Shipman. And this is one of Christopher Shipman's poems. It's called, Will the Real Secret Agent Please Stand Up? Now, when I'm wishing I could get away from everything, I'm back home in New Orleans, back to the first year there, and walking back to the corner coffee shop again. When I remember it's Easter, as a swarm of flowery dresses and fancy ties crowd to Cross Magazine. Then I look down at the dirty shirt, the one with the nerdy cat wearing glasses printed on it, the one I've worn for days, lazy haunting the house. Then I'm reminded how much of a mess I become when Sarah's gone, and Sarah's gone to Paris. But now as I notice our neighbors eating brunch outside Got Gourmet, I'm thinking of mail. I'm thinking of stacks of mail. When I see our neighbors on the way to the corner coffee shop, the neighbors I had recently house sat for while they were gone to Florida. And they thank me for the pile of mail I left on the kitchen counter and ask me to join them, but I'm trying to get good at being alone. I've been trying to get good at being alone for the past 24 hours, watching the first entire season of 24 on Netflix, the longest 24 hours of Jack Bauer's life. And now I feel like a zombie and could really use the company, but I need to be alone, so I just say thanks, but I've got to work, and take off toward the corner coffee shop. But it's closed for Easter, so I go to Starbucks and order whatever they call the biggest black coffee they've got, and take it back to the cold patio, to be alone, to get good at being alone. And now I'm remembering Sarah is 7 hours ahead and can call me up before she goes to bed if I'm logged on to the free Wi-Fi. But when I look up from messing with the settings on my phone, this muscled up guy dressed all in black pants, black backpack, black cap, black shirt, black shoes, walks through the patio. No, he kind of stomps. And now I'm imagining he must be a terrorist, that he's holding my neighbors hostage, and somewhere in Paris his people have Sarah tied to a chair, and now here he is with a phone that he'll hold up to my ear so I can hear her voice on the faraway phone, held up to her ear to know she's safe before he snatches it back and says they'll slit her pretty throat right now if I don't allow them to implement me in their plan to kill the president. But of course, when I look up again, he's gone inside, and now I'm alone again, alone on the cold patio, hoping my international text to Sarah will send before it's too late to say goodnight. Thank you. Again, that was by Christopher Shipman from his forthcoming book, Getting Away with Everything. All right. I'd like to introduce our co-host, Cassandra Atherton, who will be reading today in the main feature. Cassandra Atherton is an award-winning prose poet. Her books of prose poems include Exhumed, Trace, Picadon, Pre-Raphaelite, Leftovers, and Fugitive Letters. Cassandra co-wrote prose poetry, An Introduction, and co-edited the Anthology of Australian Prose Poetry with Paul Hetherington. She is currently working on a book of prose poetry on the atomic bomb with funding from the Australia Council. Cassandra, will you read for us today?
Yeah, I'm just going to read something short. I love books, like I'm sure most of you do. And I found this amazing book by Terry Ballinger called Lunacy and the Arrangement of Books. And it was all about how you could set up your library. You could separate the men and the women. You could put all the red books together and all of that. So I read a poem about it. Your new bookshelves are driving Deweyites mad. Spinner wheels in hand, they ache to enforce the decimal classification system on your vertical timber. Pragmatist systemizers, it doesn't matter which Dewey you prefer, Melville, John, the library cat, or even Huey and Louis's brother, but they all believe in shelf diagnosis. So choose your own system, but ask yourself, is Emma inappropriately touching Moby Dick? Is Don Juan pressed up against Clarissa or lying on top of Jane Eyre? Don't put Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina too close to the edge. And remember that given half a chance, the brothers Karamazov will lean on Little Women. Whatever you do, make sure you keep American Psycho in the plastic wrapper. Frankenstein can bring some life to your Gothic collection, but keep Dracula away from the monk and keep Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in separate sections. Don't worry if you lose the Invisible Man, Voss will go looking for him. I suppose you could order your books by the color of their spine or the birthplace of their author, but that kind of creative intelligence is, in the end, just experimental logic. So I am going to introduce the amazing Mark Vincenz, and when you hear his bio, you are going to know how incredible he is. Mark Vincenz is an Anglo-Swiss-American poet, a fiction writer, a translator, editor, publisher, designer, multi-genre artist, and musician. He has published 14 books of poetry, including more recently Becoming the Sound of Bees, Leaning into the Infinite, The Syndicate of Water and Light, and Here Comes the Night Dust. Vincenz's newest collection, The Little Book of Earthly Desires, and a novel set in ancient China, Three Taos of Tao, or How to Catch a Fortuitous Elephant, are both forthcoming in 2021 from Spite and Dival. An album of music, ambient and verse, Left Hand Clapping, is also forthcoming from Tree Torn Records. If that wasn't enough, Vincenz is also a prolific translator, and he's translated from German, Romanian, and French. He has published 10 books of translations, most recently Unexpected Development by award-winning Swiss poet and novelist Klaus Merz from White Pine in 2018, which was a finalist for the 2016 Cliff Becker Book Prize in Translation. His translation of Merz's selected poems and Audible Blue is forthcoming from White Pine in 2021. His poems have been published in so many journals, we'd take up the whole Lit Balm to read them all out, but they include The Amazing, The Nation, Plowshares, The Los Angeles Review, World Literature Today, Raritan, Asymptote, and Plume. His work has received fellowships and grants from the Swiss Arts Council, the Literary Colloquium Berlin, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Witter Brinner Foundation for Poetry. Vincenz is editor and publisher of the spectacular Mad Hat Press and publisher of the amazing New American Writing. He has lived all over the world, from Brazil to China to Iceland to India. He was born in the Matilda Hospital on the Peak in Hong Kong, but he now lives on a farm in rural western Massachusetts overlooking Herman Melville's Greylock Mountain, and where, everyone, there are more coyotes and bears than people. Mark, please read for us something from your amazing oeuvre.
Thank you, Cassandra. This is called The Tentacles of Undying Love. Only a glimpse, a fragment that holds reason. A choir of angels glorify the moment. A viper slithers through tall grass. 10,000 miles of radiant fields, falling stars flare on the river. The sticky music flows slowly, then a slant of light and a chain of crystals guide the light deep into the tissue. All those jelly-filled canals, radical pairs sensing the vibrations in the Earth's magnetic field. Out in the ocean, birds, whales, and turtles migrate. When we begin to grasp this fragment shard, this slice of memory, it clutches to us, wraps itself around us, nestles itself in among the moles between our shoulder blades. Ah, all that oxygenated air and the fireworks of pheromones, all those synapses firing. What ideal material for a god, for a demon. Demons' horns grazing the altar of love. A gigantic hammer that lands somewhere in the Mediterranean. We try to catch all the ripe fish. So is this analog to anything or nothing ventured, nothing gained? A fragment could be anything, a nail clipping, a dust mote, half a coffee cup, half a moon. Still, it's something that arrives in flux, flickering, flimmering, a meandering tentacle of fog, and yet it never leaves us until we are dust. Thank you. And of course, now we move to our future. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you everyone's background who'll be reading it tonight, celebrating Russell Edson's work and Russell Edson's life. And we have, we have Nin Andrews, who's the author of 7 chapbooks and 7 full-length poetry collections, who's won 2 Ohio Individual Artist Grants, the Pell Chapbook Contest, the Kent State University Chapbook Contest, the Gerald Cable Poetry Award, and many others. And her poems have appeared, from Agni to the Paris Review, and 4 volumes of Best American Poetry. Her book, The Last Orgasm, was published by Etruscan Press in 2020. Cassandra Atherton, who is our co-host, is an award-winning prose poet. Her books of prose poems include Exhumed, Trace, Picadon, Pre-Raphaelite, Leftovers, and Fugitive Letters. I'll leave it at that because we've already heard from Cassandra before. And then we have Maxine Chernoff, who's the author of 17 books of poetry, most recently Under the Music from Mad Hat Press in 2019. Her 6 books of fiction include an NYTBR notable book of 1993, winner of an NEA Fellowship in Poetry and a 2009 PEN USA Translation Award. She was an Academy of Rome visiting writer, and she's read and taught poetry in Brazil, England, the Czech Republic, China, Scotland, Russia, and Belgium. She's a professor of creative writing at SFSU. Chard, who joins us from Vermont, is the author of 6 books of poetry, more recently In My Unknowing from the U of Pittsburgh Press, and Interstate, also from U of Pittsburgh Press. He's author of 2 books of interviews with eminent American poets, I Would Lie to You If I Could, from Pittsburgh, and Sad Friends, Drowned Lovers, Stapled Songs from Marek Press. He's a trustee of the Ruth Stone Trust and the former Poet Laureate of Vermont from 2015 to 2019, and he lives in Westminster West with his wife Liz. Denise Duhamel's most recent book is Second Story from Pittsburgh. Her other titles include Scold, Blowout, Kaching, 2 and 2, Queen for a Day, Selected and New Poems, The Star Spangled Banner, and Kinky. She and Maureen Seaton have co-authored 4 collections, more recently Caprice from Rivalry Press. And Jeff Friedman's newest book, The Marksman, was published in November 2020 by Carnegie Mellon University Press. He's the author of 7 previous poetry collections, including Floating Tales, which appeared from Mad Hat Press, and translations with Gina Arlovsky, a selection, for example, from the Polish poet Michelosz Jastrun, published by Laventer Inc., Diagolos, in 2014. And Peter Johnson, who has corralled this gathering of prose poets and prose poets aficionados, is going to be leading the rest of this show and for the future. Peter's prose poetry have been awarded an NEA and 2 Rhode Island Council on the Arts Fellowships. His second book received the James McLaughlin Award from the Academy of American Poets. His new books are Old Man Howling at the Moon, Cast Iron Aeroplane That Can Actually Fly, which are commentaries from 80 contemporary American poets on their prose poetry. And it's been a bit of a hit, despite the fact that we have COVID, for as a teaching tool and so on. And Truths, Falsehoods, and a Wee Bit of Honesty, which just came out, which is a short primer on the prose poem with selected letters from Russell Edson. And fairly shortly, a book of short stories, Shot, will be published by Mad Hat Press as well. And we have also reading for us tonight Mary Concell, whose last book of prose poems, The Last Blonde, was recently published by Hedgerow Books, Levelers Press. And her other collections are Closer Today from Quail, and You Can Tell the Horse Anything from Tupelo, which was a finalist for Poetry Society of America's Norma Fable First Book Award. And Gian Lombardo, whose books include, sorry if I pronounce it too Italian-esque for you, the prose poetry collections, Machines We Have Built, Who Lets Go First, Aid and Abet, Of All the Corners to Forget, Sky Open Yet, Before Arguable Answers, and Standing Room. Actually, that was kind of almost a poem in itself, that list of titles. As well as the poetry collection Between Islands. And Lombardo has translated various people, including Michel Deville and Alois Bernard, and he directs Quail Press, which mainly publishes prose poetry and teaches publishing at Emerson College. I'm sure we have a few other Emersonians in the audience. Some of them are regulars. Great to see you, everybody. So, Peter, would you like to do the honors and carry us into our new adventure?
Peter, I had asked to unmute, but you've got to unmute yourself.
All right, can you hear me?
We can.
All right. I want to thank you all for being here. Besides looking forward to this tribute, because I knew Russell well, it's been nice for me to hear from old and new prose poet friends. It's been a kind of reunion of sorts. I've never been to any of my high school reunions. So for me, this is going to be, I think, a high school reunion without the jerks, Maybe someday we can all meet, in a big room, and we can celebrate and toast Russell and the prose poem. Though if it's going to be at the AWP, I think for me, you're going to have to do an intervention and blindfold and drug me to get me there. That's a joke. The problem with Zoom is there's no laugh track, so it's not like a reading. From 1992 until his death, which I think was in 2014, I got to know Russell very well, mostly through the 350 letters that he wrote me, but also from doing a few readings with him and from, phone calls periodically, and also doing a week-long conference on the prose poem, which Chard deNiord had put together. I think it's, so far, if I'm not mistaken, the only real prose poem conference on the prose poem. So what do we say about the man? I know a lot of you knew him. And in fact, it would have been easy to have 100 people on this panel. As we all know, he was a comic genius, and his letters could be as funny as his poems, sometimes childishly so. For example, he once offered in a letter to me a long disquisition on the word turd, writing, "Good news, Peter. Turd is listed in Webster's. I imagine you were one of those nasty little boys who spent his childhood looking for dirty words in every dictionary you met. So spent I my childhood. Where has it gotten us? Still, I feel a lot better knowing that turd is an actual word and not just some vulgar slang. The world feels a little safer, a little bit more secure with turd on board. We must try to find happiness with little things, Even if one doesn't get a Nobel Prize, one can still have fun writing dirty words. He began another letter with, not sure you should tell people that you write poetry. Lots of people think of poetry as a sissy sport. Trying to explain what prose poems are is even worse. It comes off as the lazy man's sissy do nothing. It's best to act as normal as possible. It helps if you think of yourself as a secret agent. And concerning death, only Russell could say this. I really don't know why we're born. If we're designed to die, and we are, why not get right to it and not be born? Oh, heck. He even gave me advice about an upcoming poetry writing. Sometimes a good strategy is to limp as you approach the reading stand. This focuses the sympathy of the audience, and from then on, you can do no wrong. But if this seems too awkward, a speech defect works too. A lisp or the inability to pronounce R's. Probably the simplest sympathy getter is to put a cushion inside the back of one's jacket and appear as the humpback of some cathedral. These are tricks of the trade. You'll probably be inventing some of your own as you go along. And yet, in spite of his, silliness and verbal hijinks, he could be, very eloquent about the poetry and the process of writing it. And I would say, especially in the first 100 letters I got from him, some of the stuff he wrote were just these incredibly lyrical Russell Edson kind of long prose poems on writing poetry. So before our poets begin, I'm just going to briefly set a context for the poems they've chosen with this one almost full letter he wrote, which brings up a few key concepts that he always talked about. Almost very frequently when I talked to him, and if he ever came to visit any of your schools, he probably talked to your students about it. He said that any poem should think well, and that all poems, especially the prose poem, should have a shape of thought or a logic of composition. And I want you to kind of have that in the back of your mind when my readers are reading. So this is a letter that one of my favorite letters, really, because it's really not that funny. It's just brilliant. It starts out funny, though. Dear Peter, I got your letter. That must mean I'm still alive. Thank you for reminding me. I was making funeral arrangements. Concerning my writing process, my best pieces seem written by someone or something else. I don't mean automatic writing or stream of consciousness exactly, but writing in such a way that one dreams while being fully awake. In a sense, this kind of writing needs to be orderly and compact because it has no set borders. There's only room for working parts. The writer needs the courage to drop the good stuff for the sake of the poem's psychological movement. Another fault occurs with the writer who doesn't trust his imagination and does too much situating or scene setting. The result is too many words chasing too few ideas. Remember, words are the enemy of poetry. And then he goes on. A piece of writing must not only have the logic of language, but the logic of composition. A poem is a mental object and requires one's best mental abilities. We work best when our intellects and imaginations are in harmony at the time of the writing. But I like to go real fast before I ruin what I'm writing by thinking about it. This is not automatic writing. It's looking for the shape of thought more than the particulars of the little narrative. The shape of thought has to do with an abstract argument between reality and the organ of reality, the brain. This means I cannot afford to violate the logic of the prose. My pieces, when they work, though full of odd happenings, win the argument against disorder through the logic of language and a compositional wholeness. So my ideal prose poem is a small, complete work, utterly logical within its own madness. This is different than surrealism, which usually takes the commonplace and makes it strange and leaves it there. The prose poem is a place of image and gesture, which makes the prose poem a miraculous contradiction, which also makes the writing of the same an act of sanity, whole brain thinking. Language is consciousness, but the source of the creative is not. It's all a kind of dreaming awake. It really comes down to an intuition more than a technique. I mean, I don't think there's many things that have been said about poetry that can even compare to that. It's just, to me, it's just, well, I can't swear, so let's just say it's amazing. I guess I can do anything I want, right? Because everybody's muted, so nobody can protest. All right, so let's start. And we'll start with Nin Andrews, who's been going first probably since she's been about 8 years old in grammar school. Nin?
Yes. Well, my married name is Andrews, so I wasn't always in the front of the class. So yeah. So I'm just so delighted to be part of this event in honor of Russell Edson, whom I had the pleasure of meeting when we were both teaching at that Prose poetry conference that Chard and Peter put together many years ago. I remember being so excited to meet Edson, and he was exactly whom I imagined him to be. Funny, kind, authentic, charming, plain-spoken. He looked like one of his woodcuts, and he spoke like his poetry. I think that's the reason his letters are so interesting too. I know with many poets, there is a dividing line between the artist and the art. Not so with Edson. I remember we had dinner together once. I told him how nervous I was about giving readings. He said, "You've already written the poems, Nin. Why worry about reading them?" Then he paused and grinned. "Are you going to be reading orgasm poems?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled. "Aren't you too skinny for orgasms?" The question has stuck with me. On the final evening of the conference, we all gave our readings. Robert Bly stood up first and read the way he always did, like a preacher or a prophet. Then Edson read. The first poem he read was The Large Thing. Only in my memory, and I don't know if this is right, but in my memory, he personalized it, and he spoke it as if the wife were talking. So this is how I remember the poem beginning. A large thing comes in. "Go out, large thing," says the wife. The large thing goes out and comes in again. "Go out, large thing, and stay out," says the wife. The large thing goes out and it stays out. Then that same wife who has been ordering the large thing out begins to feel lonely and says, "Come in, large thing." The poem goes on, but in seconds, the audience was in hysterics. I don't think anyone could breathe except for Robert Bly, who was sitting next to me. He leaned over and said, "I try so hard to capture an audience. I think I succeed." And then Edson stands up and the audience goes wild. Edson also read my favorite poem, Sleep, a poem that makes fun of the human desire for self-improvement. Like most Edson poems, it moves on two levels, one of amusing narrative and one of dark psychological truth. The humor is what clinches the poem and perhaps all of his poems. It's the magic sauce of his poetry. Sleep. There was a man who didn't know how to sleep, nodding off every night into a drab, unprofessional sleep that he'd grown so tired of sleeping. He tried reading the manual of sleep, but it just put him to sleep. That same old sleep he had grown so tired of sleeping. He needed a sleeping master who with a whip and a chair would discipline the night and make him jump through hoops of gasolined fire. Someone who could make a tiger sit on a tiny pedestal and yawn. I'm going to close by reading a poem in honor of Edson in memory of his comment that I'm too skinny for orgasms, a poem modeled on sleep. Little Woman. There was once an orgasm who could not stop shrinking. Little Woman, her friends called her, watching as she grew thinner and thinner with each passing night, first before making love, then before the mention of making love, then before even the mention of making love. Oh, what a pathetic little thing she was. One night she tried reading Think and Grow Big, imagining that once again she could become round and soft, but it only caused her to shrink further into herself. I think this book was written for men, she sighed, remembering how men followed her scent like bloodhounds. What they needed, she read, was a little challenge, a game of fetch, a fight, someone to help them work up an appetite, to feed them one morsel at a time, to pat their heads, say, good boy, instead of sit, stay, lie down. Thank you.
I think alphabetically, I'm
Cassandra,
next.
sorry, I forgot I'm doing something here. Go ahead, Cassandra.
No problem. That was wonderful, Nin. How amazing. It's hard to come after you. I am going to talk about my encounter with Russell Edson, but it wasn't the person, the man, sadly. But in Australia, he is still super famous and on most of the university courses. And so I thought I'd talk a bit about that and read my favorite Edson poem. So at secondary school, when the other students had posters of Johnny Depp and Leonardo DiCaprio and Justin Timberlake in their lockers, I had an A3 size photocopy of Russell Edson stuck up on the inside of my locker. It was a black and white photo. You've probably seen the one around a lot because there doesn't seem to be a huge number of photos. And he's not looking into the camera, and he has a check shirt and tie on and maybe a corduroy jacket. And underneath it was the quote, "If one cannot accept failure and scorn, how is he to make his art? It's like wanting to go to heaven without dying." And I think that sort of kept me alive my whole secondary school. So Edson was my poster boy. His writing seemed exciting and strange in ways that everything else kind of seemed a little boring and beige. And my literature teacher made me first aware of his books after we had this horrible moment for me where the class divided into poets and fiction writers, and I sort of stood somewhere in between waiting like a kind of literary version of being chosen for a sporting team, and nobody wanted me because they didn't know what to do with the only person who seemed to be writing something that didn't fit in either category. And prose poetry in Australia just wasn't taking off at that time. It was a totally an unknown quantity. And I think my teacher felt bad for me, and the next day she gave me the poster and introduced me to Edson, and he has had a profound effect on my work. And I always make sure that my students know who he is and read him. But we did a survey in Australia not so long ago, and he and Charles Simic were considered the two most famous and enduring prose poets, which is wonderful. Today I'm going to read one of my favorite poems called "Oh My God, I'll Never Get Home." It still makes me laugh. It reminds me how we've all felt like this at some point after a really long day or a really long night. And it's I think one of the things that I continue to learn from Edson all these years later is how amazing his endings are. My endings to my prose poems are kind of my Achilles heel, and he's just brilliant at it. I mean, there's just something so special and clever, and the way that it opens out in the end is wonderful. So, oh my God, I'll never get home. A piece of a man had broken off in a road. He picked it up and put it in his pocket. As he stooped to pick up another piece, he came apart at the waist. His bottom half was still standing. He walked over on his elbows and grabbed the seat of his pants and said, "Legs, go home." But as they were going along, his head fell off. His head yelled, "Legs, stop." And then one of his knees came apart. But meanwhile, his heart had dropped out of his trunk. As his head screamed, "Legs, turn around," his tongue fell out. Oh my God, he thought, I'll never get home. I love the whimsical moment of the heart falling out of the torso. So I think the next person, Peter, is Maxine. Is that right?
Yeah, Maxine Chernoff is next. And Maxine, she was writing prose poems way before it was cool. So you're on, Maxine.
Can you unmute yourself, Maxine?
Okay, I did it. I'm here. I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can, we
I
can.
seem to be frozen.
Yes, you are, but we can hear you.
Can people? Am I here? Am I talking to you? Okay.
Yes, you
I'm
are.
not moving on my screen, so I can't tell. It's true. I started writing prose poems in the early 70s, and there weren't many American writers that I knew of who were, but Russell Edson was one of them. And I was so happy when I found him. Um, I think finding him and also finding Clarice Lispector, simply because she was a woman, were the two best finds of my early career in writing prose poems in my 20s. So it's many years after, and in between, I published one of his little books with Paul Hoover between our doing Oink and New American Writing. We published a book of his called Edson's Mentality, which might still be around. You can check online. I don't know if we have any here anymore or not. Um, and the one time I met Russell was when he read in Chicago for a series done at the Poetry Center that I and Paul Hoover were also involved in. Paul had him in, and we went to dinner with him and Frances, his wife, and they were quite charming together. You could see that they had a very close relationship, even to the point of, say, when he began reading, Frances said, Russell, Russell, don't read that poem, and then he would choose a different poem. So it was an interesting evening of kind of performance as well as poetry. And what I admire about Russell Edson is the idea of being a fabulist, telling fables, getting to the real meat of life, getting to the point where what's tragic also is funny, getting to a point where things disappear and transform and transmogrify, but all in a very normal cadence, all in a very quiet way. In a sense, he's not grand in his gestures. His language is tight, and I always appreciated that about him. So Nin's anecdote about Bly and Edson, they're really polar opposites. And I always appreciated the Edson side of that spectrum more than the other side. But they both have their place, and I was just very grateful to meet him, correspond with him a bit, publish him a good deal of times, and teach him to my students who always think he's great. Anyway, what I've chosen to read is his poem about counting sheep. And I'll read it now, if I get it here. A scientist had a test tube full of sheep. He wonders if he should try to shrink a pasture for them. They are like grains of rice. He wonders if it is possible to shrink something out of existence. He wonders if the sheep are aware of their tininess, if they have any sense of scale. Perhaps they think the test tube is a glass barn. He wonders what he should do with them. They certainly have less meat and wool than ordinary sheep. Has he reduced their commercial value? He wonders if they can be used as a substitute for rice, a sort of woolly rice. He wonders if he shouldn't rub them into a red paste between his fingers. He wonders if they are breeding, or if any of them have died. He puts them under a microscope and falls asleep counting them. So the really nice conflation with size and what material, a tiny sheep the size of a grain of rice is just pretty wonderful. And that's often what Russell does, is he either inflates or deflates things, and often he's doing both. So a lot of his poems are really about power relationships. And what's funny about them is how playfully he treats that. But under there's a good deal of seriousness about what people do to things in their lives, and how we treat our spouses, and how we treat our pet apes, and all kinds of things are treated in his writing, which is always delightful. I thought I would close with a early prose poem of mine that shows a lot of influence of Russell Edson, which is why I chose it. My more recent work, less so. But this one is called Vanity, Wisconsin. Firemen wax their mustaches at an alarm. Walls with mirrors are habitually saved. At the grocery, women in line polish their shopping carts. Children too will learn that one buys meat the color of one's hair, vegetables to complement the eyes. There is no crime in Vanity, Wisconsin. Shoplifters are too proud to admit a need. Punishment, the dismemberment of a favorite snapshot, has never been practiced in modern times. The old are of no use, and once a year at their debut, they're asked to join their reflections in Lake LeBlanc. Cheerfully they dive in, vanity teaching them not to float. A visitor is not embarrassed to sparkle there or stand on his hotel balcony, taking pictures of his pictures. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me participate, and this is a wonderful event.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you. And next, we'll be hearing from Chard deNiord. If we can make sure that you're unmuted.
Chard, you gotta unmute yourself. It's the first time I'll ever say that to you, I'm sure, but go ahead.
There we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
All right, great. Great to see everyone. Thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this. It's a great thrill and honor. Before I read any poems, I thought I would just say a few words about Peter's new book. This is what the cover looks like. No, this is actually just a piece of paper, but it says Truths, Falsehoods, and Wee Bits of Honesty, a short primer on the prose poem with selected letters from Russell Edson. And Mark is publishing this wonderful book. And I wrote a few things about it. This is not the blurb I wrote, but I wrote this as an introduction to one of Peter's letters that appeared in Plume. Writing to each other from the periphery of the mainstream poetry world, or as both Edson and Johnson might say, from the peanut gallery of PoBiz. These poets discovered right where the best seats are for viewing the state of American poetry, as well as for writing their own poems. In this selection of letters by Russell Edson and Peter Johnson, Edson displays both his humorous and serious sensibility at once, demonstrating just how integral they are to each other, and in so doing, witnessing to Charles Simich's claim that, quote, all poets do magic tricks with spontaneity and nonchalance, concealing art and giving the impression that one writes without effort and almost without thinking, as a remedy for every bane of affection. I wish Charlie were here tonight with us to read some of Russell's poems and to talk about Russell as well. This conference, which took place in Walpole, New Hampshire, over 10 years ago, was just such a wonderful, I wish we could have done it over and over again. Let's see, I'm gonna put a picture up. Can you folks see this picture? Can you see this? There's Nin. There's Nin sitting next to Russell. And there's Russell with my dog in his lap, a Springer Spaniel. And he's just got the funniest expression on his face. And there's Robert Bly leaning over saying something to Russell. There's me and there's Peter. And unfortunately, Mary's not in this picture. She was there also. But I just thought you'd love to see that. And here's a picture of Bly and Edson at that same conference. So I'm glad we took a few pictures. I can remember asking Russell why he came all the way from Minnesota to this conference when he was pretty elderly. And he said there was only one reason I came to this, to be with Russell Edson. And so it was quite a trip for him to do. So that was an amazing testimony to Russell. I'm going to read a poem of Russell's, and then I'll just read one of mine. But before I read a poem by Russell called Poetry, I wanted just to tell a very brief story about a visit that Russell Edson made to New England College. Again, over 10 years ago, 15 years ago at least. And he was talking about prose poetry, and he got into an argument. He didn't start the argument, but one of the faculty in the program, I won't mention his name, started arguing with him about poetry. He's saying poetry is comprised of lines. Prose poetry is not poetry. And he went back and forth with Russell on this, and Russell just kind of stood there implacably without defending the prose poem. But finally, after this person got really heated about this, Russell just looked at him with the most calm and just a confident expression I've seen on anyone practically, and said, "Poetry is poetry mind." And the person didn't know what to say to that. And that was the end of the exchange between them. This is a poem by Russell simply called Poetry. You will hear her, the muse. She knocks 3 times. Past that, she knocks no more. The password is nonsense. This begins the secret which hides the final message. You will sit in the dark, waiting for the 3 knocks. Do not be fooled by the coming of the 3 little pigs, or the old man who hobbles on a cane, the one who slays the Sphinx at the end of the game. The consummation is nonsense, without which the road of the final message is overgrown with meaning, and the vagueness of everything is everywhere. And I'll just conclude by reading a prose poem. It's in this book called The Double Truth that came out, again, about 10 years ago in 2011. It's called The Police. And I think one of the best things about writing prose poems is that you really don't know often that you're writing them when you're writing them. And that was the case with this poem, The Police. The first quarter of this poem is actually true, and then it takes off after that into an imagined scenario. We were in bed when a knock came at the door. Our bed was next to the front door, since we had given up our only bedroom to our 2 children and partitioned off a part of our large living room with standing bookcases into a second bedroom for us. It was 10:30 on a Sunday night. The knocks resounded hard and quick. I was reading Czesław Miłosz's The Witness of Poetry in preparation for a seminar the next morning. My wife, Rachel, was reading Soren Kierkegaard's The Concept of Irony. Who could that be? I asked, rising naked from bed and putting on my bathrobe. I opened the door to find 2 police officers. Come in, gentlemen, I said. The uniformed men entered and stood over our bed. Rachel pulled the sheet up to her neck. I stood at the end of the bed. We're here because a Mrs. Little called, she said. She's been trying to reach you since yesterday, but the phone's been busy. I picked up the phone by the bed and heard a faint static through the receiver. The phone is broken, I said. We got in this evening, officer, from a weekend trip and haven't used the phone since we got back. Maybe it was the tornado that knocked it out. The policemen stood sheepishly together. Rachel smiled with embarrassment for her mother. I, on the other hand, had a strange impulse to invite the 2 policemen to bed with us, but said instead, would it be too much to ask one of you to call Mrs. Little back to assure her that we're okay? They were kind Midwestern policemen who said they would be happy to do this. I imagined them climbing into bed with us and falling asleep while we stripped them of their uniforms and put them on ourselves and held their empty weapons to our necks and heads and groins and kissed each other over their veteran bodies while they slept deeply in their exhaustion. We thanked these men for their prompt response to my mother-in-law's concern for us. I wanted to tell them, you've given me a larger sense of myself, as well as assuring me of something I wondered about before, namely the inherent goodness of the police, whose abruptness and armed appearance and lack of tact and laconic style I forgive this time, because my mother-in-law was concerned about us and had nowhere else to turn except to you. But I knew also that they didn't expect this and probably wouldn't have understood my sentiment exactly. Strangely, what I think they would have understood and probably responded to if their duty had not prevented them from getting too close to their public, was an invitation to come to bed with us fully clothed, for it was late. They were tired, and this is what we wanted. Thank you.
Thank you, Chard.
Right.
And next up, we have Denise Duhamel. Denise.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. The poem that I've chosen to read is Sweet Tooth, and this is from Russell Edson's book, The Tormented Mirror. Sweet Tooth. A little girl made of sugar and spice and everything nice was eaten by someone with a sweet tooth the size of an elephant's tusk. Ah, he said, this darn tooth, it's driving me nuts. Then another voice is heard. It's the little girl's father who says, have you seen a little girl made of sugar and spice and everything nice? Incidentally, what's that thing sticking out of your mouth like an elephant's tusk? My sweet tooth, and it's really driving me nuts. You ought to see a dentist. But he might want to pull it, and I don't like people pulling at me. If they want to pull, they should pull at their own pullables. So true, said the little girl's father. People should pull at their own pullables and let other people's pullables alone. But still, he asked again, I wonder if you'd seen a little girl made of sugar and spice and everything nice. So I absolutely love this poem for so many reasons, but the twisting of the cliche of, the little girl of sugar and spice and everything nice really does become a piece of cake or candy or something. And the same with the sheep poem that Maxine read, this idea of counting sheep is just a cliche. So in anyone else's hands, it would be horrible. And yet Russell Edson is just able to turn things on their head and just do amazing work. And the sweet tooth, of course, just an expression, but suddenly in his poem, it's like a big tooth tusk thing. And then of course, the undercurrent of taboo, which is pretty much, I guess, in all his poems, this like sexual taboo, and the weirdness of the father who is like seemingly looking for the daughter, but then gets distracted by talking about this man's tooth and going to the dentist and seems to forget about the daughter completely. So these fables or the fabulous impulse that he has is just so amazing to me that he can pull it off, and it's hilarious and psychologically fraught and just amazing. So I was one of the people here, I guess, who never did have Cassandra said the same, that we never had the chance to meet Russell Edson except through his poems. And I love that this event is called Little Mr. Prose Poems because of that shrinking and enlarging way that he has of, this giant tooth, the little tiny grains of sheep rice or whatever, this big and small back and forth. So I wrote a little tribute to Russell Edson. How I first became aware of my body image problem, a tribute to Russell Edson. When I was born, I weighed 8 pounds and 9 ounces, rather on the chubby side for a baby, but nothing to be that embarrassed about until they put me in the incubator with all the preemies because I had been born with bronchitis, with mucus in my lungs, so I couldn't breathe well on my own. Fathers and grandmas lined up at the window where the babies were displayed like rows of TVs all playing at once. People scanned along, searching for the surname of the baby they'd know as their own, having been warned that the precious little head might only be as big as a golf ball, that the eyes wouldn't open for a long time yet. Worried and nervous about this new Pee-wee addition to the family, they gasped when along the way they saw me, straining at the boundaries of my plastic egg, 3 times as big as some of the other babies, a TV as big as a movie screen. Then, when I was a few months old, Russell Edson shrunk to the size of a pacifier and crawled inside one, his body barely visible through that yellow translucence. He felt bad for me, my having gone through all that trauma in the hospital, and also wanted to write a poem about what it was really like for babies. He hung himself on a metal rack at the supermarket, where my mother, distracted with so many new obligations, cloth diapers, strained carrots, pablum, threw him into the shopping cart without noticing the tiny blue veins on his face, his yellow bow tie and brown suit. At the time, I could only see in black and white, all the Disney characters hanging on my walls monochromatic, so I couldn't appreciate the way Russell Edson tried to camouflage himself. I also wasn't aware that grown-up people weren't usually that small, and I had never even heard of prose poems. I had the courtesy to spit Russell Edson out. Even as a toothless infant, I knew I had the power to suck up some small particle and kill it. Russell Edson talked to me when no one else was around. He warned me that I'd grow up to be a poet, that I too would have to go to extreme lengths if I was ever going to be any good. This was way before Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, for which I noticed Russell Edson was suspiciously left out of the credits. Being a poet is like that. You're way ahead of your time about everything. Then Hollywood comes by years later and makes a movie about something you thought of 30 or so years ago. But having Russell Edson as my first tiny teacher, I knew what to expect, which is not that much. In fact, the final draft of Russell Edson's poem, which was initially inspired by me, wound up being about something else completely, which often happens when a poet tucks his imagination like pigskin under his arm and runs ahead like mad. I'm leaving out all the parts that came later about my training bras, my near fatal love of donuts. Let's just say I felt like a huge blubbering baby as that great and minuscule poet danced around my crib trying to get back in.
Thank you, Denise. Next, we hear from Jeff Friedman.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks to Mark and Cassie and Jonathan for hosting this event. And thanks, Peter, for inviting me and for organizing everything as well. Like Denise, I never met Russell Edson. Actually, I'm a big fan of his work and I've been reading it since graduate school. I think Larry Levis, when I was in graduate school, handed me a copy of his book to read. And since then, I've been reading it, regularly every year. I go through most of his work, most years, actually. This year, I feel like it was a great year with all that was going on in the Trump administration to actually read his book over and over again because of the humor and to kind of pull you away from it. And also because the logic is so crazy in the Trump administration. It takes somebody like reading an Edson to kind of defeat that logic, really, to get out of that. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be celebrating Edson and also to be celebrating Peter's book and his letters with Edson and the invaluable insights on the prose poem that Peter has as well. I would like to say that I was sitting there thinking about what poem, I kept going back and forth between the poem of Edson's that I was going to choose. And it was between the bridge and the taxi. I ended up choosing the taxi, but I kept thinking to myself, the bridge is, whenever I get to the part where the ape in the pith helmet bites off his hand eating the banana, and then later just the punchline of the explorer offering him another banana. It's like a laugh out loud moment in his poem. So I truly love that poem, but I ended up choosing the taxi, and I think I chose the taxi because so I could possibly get in something from the Italo Calvino's essay Lightness, so I could say something from that, which is truly an essay I love. So I thought I'd be able to quote, bring them together. But so I'm going to read Taxi. One night in the dark, I phoned for a taxi. Immediately, a taxi crashes through the wall. Never mind that my room is on the 3rd floor, or that the yellow driver is really a cluster of canaries arranged in the shape of a driver who flutters apart, streaming from the windows of the taxi in yellow fountains. Realizing that I'm in the midst of something splendid, I reach for the phone and cancel the taxi. All the canaries flow back into the taxi and assemble themselves into a cluster shaped like a man. The taxi backs through the wall and the wall repairs. But I cannot stop what is happening. I'm already reaching for the phone to call a taxi, which is already beginning to crash through the wall with its yellow driver already beginning to flutter apart. So I truly love that poem. And I think, it appeared in this book, The Reason Why the Closet Man Is Never Sad, which is I think it's my favorite Edson book, along with The Bridge, by the way. You can see there's some nice plastic on this book. It's an old book. I've had it for a long time. It starts out to me that opening where because if you think back to the 70s, you know, and calling for a taxi in the dark, you know, you can do it, but it's like a punchline, because I remember waiting for taxis for hours to come. And so in this poem, the taxi immediately arrives and crashes through a third floor wall. So I really like, to me, that almost reads like a punchline, but many of Branson's poems begin with some kind of humor, and like a Jewish comedian, he sort of ends with something really serious a lot of times too. So he has that side of it. It's both dark and serious and a little destructive in places. The prose paragraphs in this poem create a rhythm of the imagination. I think Edson uses the simple act of a man in the dark reaching for a phone to unlock this wild panoply of images, colors, and transformations. And then in the second paragraph to cancel the images. And then in the third paragraph to begin them all again. The poem charts the mind in motion as it crosses the boundary between vision and madness, dream and nightmare, order and chaos. And I, you know, as I think about this poem, if I were trying to write it, I kept thinking every step of the way, like, where would you go after he writes the first paragraph and the transformations that occurs, and like, what do you do next? So, I mean, I think then his next step is to cancel everything, which I think is like really kind of brilliant. And then it's like, well, what do you do now? I mean, what story do you tell after that? Well, you start the whole thing over again. And that's part of the obsessive kind of loop nature of this particular poem. Anyway, I think it's a great example of how Edson strips away what John Milton in the 17th century referred to as the ornament in verse to find a truer poetry in prose. And I get to say my Italo Calvino quotation. Italo Calvino in his essay Lightness talks about trying to remove weight, sometimes from people, sometimes from cities, above all from the structure of stories and language, to attain another level of perception. And I really feel like that Taxi is a poem that utilizes lightness to reach that other level of perception or truth. Okay, and I thought, you know, I might just read one of my own poems recently written and recently published in New World Writing. And I think it in some way responds to Edson. Maybe, yeah. Lost memory. My sister stole a memory of mine from my house and took it home, hidden in her coat. I couldn't remember the memory, but there was an empty space in the sideboard under the window. Give me back the memory, I said, standing outside her door, and I won't report you to the authorities. She let me in. Don't be ridiculous, she said. Why would I steal a memory of yours? It didn't take me long to find the memory, a blue jar sitting on the glass stand between two chairs. When I picked it up, she looked puzzled. This is my place, she said. These are my things. Not true, I replied, and unscrewed the lid. Emptiness wafted out with its stinging scent. Now I remembered something I had wanted to forget. I screwed the lid back on quickly and set it down. That's my memory, she said. You shouldn't have opened it. Then what do you remember, I asked. Nothing. It's gone because you let it out. And as I stood there, angry at my sister, the scent of the memory evaporated. And all I could remember was the jar. And now that belonged to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And next we'll be hearing from, well, one of our organizers of this event, Peter Johnson.
Yeah, hi. I had to laugh and then was reading from the large thing because I changed my mind at the last minute and chose the large thing, but she didn't finish reading it, so that's okay. I did a dissertation on comedy. I've been a student of comedy. Three of the big techniques of comedy are exaggeration, juxtaposition, and repetition. And you can see how the repetition in the large thing really creates comedy. You see that in a lot of Edson's work. If you know Edson's work at all, he has a great poem called Throwing the Captain Overboard, where they keep throwing the captain overboard and he keeps getting back on, they keep throwing the captain. And as usual, they're not sure whether they want to throw the captain overboard, but they throw him over anyway. So I'm going to read the large thing here. And this too, I agree with Jeff. This is my favorite book too. The Reason Why the Closet Man is Never Sad. It's an amazing book. The large thing. A large thing comes in. Go out, large thing, says someone. The large thing goes out and comes in again. Go out, large thing, and stay out, says someone. The large thing goes out and stays out. Then that same someone who has been ordering the large thing out begins to be lonely and says, come in, large thing. But when the large thing is in, that same someone decides it would be better if the large thing would go out. Go out, large thing, says this same someone. The large thing goes out. Oh, why did I say that, says the someone, who begins to be lonely again. But meanwhile, the large thing has come back in anyway. Good. I was just about to call you back, says the same someone to the large thing. And the poem I'm going to read is called The Incredible Shrinking Orgasm. No, I'm just trying to get back at Nin for reading that poem. It's actually called Vaccination in the broadest sense of the term, which is sort of a COVID poem, I guess, right? It's very new. But I realize the repetition I use in here is you're going to see the spider keeps coming back in the poem. When we talk about influence and we say, you know, that, well, this Edson poem influenced me to write this, I've always thought influence is kind of a tricky business. I wonder sometimes how often just a lot of this stuff happens unconsciously from reading a lot of different writers. Because after I finished this poem, I was maybe about a couple of weeks later, I was reading Baudelaire and realized that this poem also has a lot in common with, I think it's 1 o'clock in the morning, if you know that poem by Baudelaire. All right, vaccination in the broadest sense of the term. Just as the pharmacist drove the vaccine into my arm, I thought, so what did you do today, Peter? I shaved, then looked into the mirror without disappointment, wondering why it took 69 years for that to happen. I had an argument with my wife about a biblical plague of ants that had overrun her underwear drawer. I killed a huge spider clinging to the inside of the shower curtain, then washed it down the drain. It crawled out, so I killed it again. At 10 a.m., I had a headache the size of Bangladesh. At 11 a.m., it was gone. And by noon, a woodpecker had an unfortunate encounter with my sliding glass door. I went for a coffee, argued with a pickup trucker with a nose ring who taunted me for wearing a mask. I spoke with 2 monks outside the grocery store about the pitfalls of wrestling with the unexpected. I went home. The woodpecker had regained consciousness, then flown away. The spider was back, so I killed it again. I went to the library, spoke of the failure of trickle-down economics with the janitor. I left. I gave a lecture about hopefulness to a bunch of squirrels sharing a bagel under a Japanese Zokova tree. I stopped at the pond and watched the baby geese make their stunning debut. I called my wife, told her to hang in there, that the sequel would be much better. She laughed, then said there was a huge spider clinging to a picture of me on her nightstand, his thorax eclipsing my face. It's so big you can see its eyes, she said. I told her to ignore it. It had earned the right to live. There you go. That's it.
Thank you, Peter. And next we'll be hearing from Mary Concell.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having this. And Peter, congratulations on the book of Russell Edson's poems and letters. I'm going to start off just telling a little bit of a story, a couple of stories actually. I first encountered prose poems when I was, this is many, many years ago, when I was a student at Columbia College in Chicago. And we had a great instructor and poet, Paul Hoover, who taught a class on prose poetry. And I have to say, I loved all the prose poets, but I especially loved Russell's poems because of the humor. So after that class, everybody set out and started writing these horrible imitation of Russell Edson poems. And I have to say, I continued. I'm not sure what anybody else did, but skip ahead a few years, and I was getting my MFA at UMass Amherst. And fortunately, I ended up, Russell ended up coming to teach. and he was my thesis advisor. And I think I share the distinction of being the only person who ever had Russell as my thesis advisor. So that's my claim to literary fame. But anyway, we spent a year meeting once a week, and it was interesting. We had lots of conversations about why Connecticut drivers are different than Massachusetts drivers and why doorways are scary. But we also had some very serious talks about prose poetry. And several of the lessons, I'm going to say, because I think they were lessons, were something Peter had talked about, and maybe somebody else, the importance of the logic of composition in prose poetry, and also too the importance of compression, really stripping away and finding the essence of a poem. And when I write today, I still always remember that, because I think it what is really makes a prose poem a good prose poem. I want to read a poem from What a Man Can See. I have my own collection, my own book in my collection. And I'm going to read the poem called The Fall, because I think it really is a great example of all that makes a good prose poem. I think, like I said, that compression, that logic of composition, and also dialogue too. I'm in love with dialogue. I think it just works so well in a prose poem. So this is called The Fall. There was a man who found 2 leaves and came indoors, holding them out, saying to his parents that he was a tree. To which they said, "Then go into the yard and do not grow in the living room, as your roots may ruin the carpet." He said, "I was fooling. I am not a tree," and he dropped his leaves. But his parents said, "Look, it is fall." So it's one of my favorite poems. Again, I love the simplicity, but also the complexity of that poem. I also wanted to mention that after Russell was finished his year teaching at UMass, we had a party for him, and it was at my apartment. In my apartment, there was a field behind it in the cemetery. And I have to say, Russell spent most of the time at the party in the cemetery, so with some other people. But one of the things we did, everybody loved Russell, of course, and we had found out that he didn't have an MFA. So we awarded him an MFA. We made a big certificate for him, and the MFA stood for Mighty Fine Artist. And several years later, actually it was probably 10 or 15 years later, at the Prose Poem Conference, Frances and I were talking, and she said to me, she said, Russell loves that diploma. And she said he really treasures it. And that made me feel so good, because I felt like he gave me such a gift. And I felt like that was something that, we were able to reciprocate. So I'm going to read, if I can find it, what did I do with it? Oh, okay. I'm going to read one prose poem this is a really old prose poem. And I wrote it when I was actually a graduate student. It started off, I think, with maybe 6 or 7 stanzas. And afterwards, it ended up with 2 short stanzas. It's called The Neighborhood Man. A dog is rolling in the grass. A man walks by and thinks the dog is drowning. But the man's not sure, because he's just a neighbor. The dog is very convincing, turning over and over, its long legs kicking up clumps of grass. The man strips off his suit, drops to his knees, and rolls in after the dog. He hopes the dog can hold on just a while longer. The man is having problems. He's getting very tired, barely able to keep his head above the grass. It's very late. He hopes this will be over soon, but the dog is getting smaller, the grass much deeper. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And next we'll be hearing from Gian Lombardo.
Thank you. First off, I'd like to say this is way overdue. Russell passed away almost 7 years ago, and we're finally celebrating and memorializing him. I think it's just really way overdue. And I really want to thank Peter for pulling this together, and for Mark and Jonathan and Cassandra for being the hosts for this. You guys, your work is really appreciated here. This needs to be done. Needed to be done 7 years ago. Needs to be done now. Not too late. Anyhow, I want to talk a little bit about the poem I selected, which is Ape. And I picked it, well, for one major reason. It's one where, well, first off, I only met Russell once, and I think it was, if my memory serves right, I think Holly and I were unannounced guests at Prose Poetry Conference, and we met him there. But I discovered him way back in the mid 70s in I think it was Michael Benedict's anthology. That's where I found his work, and it was a revelation. In some ways, he was doing something fairly different. I had been writing prose poems without knowing I was writing prose poems for about 5 or 6 years before that, started in high school, and only learned by reading French literature and Baudelaire, Bertrand, Rimbaud, and realized, oh, that's what I'm doing. And then finding Russell. And so I got that, and I had through the 80s and 90s an occasional correspondence with him, and tried to, I published him in my magazine Kisach a couple times, and I was trying to get him to publish a book with Quale Press, my press, and he kept saying, no, I'm going to do a Sun and Moon. No, I'm going to do a New Rivers. I'm going to do this. And I think he finally didn't do either one. And he came out with, I think from Pittsburgh, from one of his last books, came out from there. So, but I'm going to read a few excerpts from his letters after the poem. But in the meantime, so I understood it. I came to his work around the mid 70s. And in 1978, a friend at a party. Now I want to give a little bit of background here that I belong to a group of friends from high school and college who worship rubber apes. We're sort of a cargo cult. This is how we get together. And once a year, we would get together and have a competition to see who made the best spaghetti sauce. So at one of these events in 1978, there'd be week-long, weekend festivities, and there'd be skits and songs and speeches during the day before the competition. And one of my friends, who was a medical student, as his speech, read Russell's Ape, and I nearly died. I did say, how did anybody else know about this person here? This is 1978, that through the circle. How did anybody else know? So the two came together. And then I'll read Ape, and then I'll tell you the rest of the story through here. So I'm going to use a photocopy from Benedict's book. You haven't finished your Ape, said mother to father. Who had monkey hair and blood on his whiskers? I've had enough, monkey, cried father. You didn't eat the hands. And I went to all the trouble to make onion rings for its fingers, said mother. I'll just nibble on his forehead, and then I've had enough, said father. I stuffed its nose with garlic, just like you like it, said mother. Why don't you have the butcher cut these apes up? You lay the whole thing on the table every night, the same fractured skull, the same singed fur. It's like someone who died horribly. These aren't dinners. These are post-mortem dissections. Try a piece of its gum. I've stuffed its mouth with bread, said mother. Ah, it looks like a mouthful of vomit. How can I bite into its cheek with bread spilling out of its mouth? Cried father. Break off one of its ears. They're so crispy, said mother. I wish to hell you'd put underpants on these apes. Even a jockstrap, screamed father. Father, how dare you insinuate that I see the ape as anything more than a simple meat? Screamed mother. Well, what with this ribbon tied in a bow on its privates? Well, what's with this ribbon tied with a bow on its privates, said father. Are you saying that I'm in love with this violent creature? That I would submit my female opening to this brute? That after we had love on kitchen floor, I would put him in the oven after breaking his head with a frying pan and then serve him to my husband, that my husband might eat the evidence of my infidelity? I'm just saying that I'm damn sick of ape every night, cried father. Okay. It's one of the poems. One thing that is remarkable about Edson is that people say he's a fabulist and he's this great person in terms of narrative. But this poem and a lot of the others, I find are the work of a playwright, a dramatist. These are not monologues, but these are dialogues. These are sketches, mini plays that are going on here. And this is just one of the wonderful ones. But anyhow, in the meantime, about 15 years after this, in my correspondence with that Russell, I invited him to come to one of these spaghetti sauce competitions. I wrote up, what happened and everything going on and tried to convince him to come. So I'm going to read a couple excerpts from his letters. Him very politely and shyly declining to come. The first excerpt. I shall arrive in late summer in a sedan chair borne by 2 apes. So he's saying he's going to come. But a few months later, he says, I was only kidding about visiting East Lyme for pasta. In the first place, I don't have a matched set of apes. But more importantly, I don't have a sedan chair. Never did have one. And I never go any place without a sedan chair and a matched set of apes. And then there's always Lyme disease to think about. And that I'm a hermit. You say you're tall and thin. Well, I'm short and sort of thick, about 5'4", 300 pounds plus. But hey, we all have to manifest some physical presence or not be here at all. So he didn't come. And I want to read just a couple other excerpts from a few of his letters. And one I'm sort of going to throw in sort of a little nod of the head to Diane DePrima, who passed away just recently. And this is an excerpt that Russell's talking about Diane. So he says, I used to know Diane DePrima in her salad days. She was always dressed in fresh garden vegetables, the kind of stuff that used to grow in the Garden of Eden. She always wore a bustle made of lettuce hanging from her can and a dollop of mayonnaise on her tulip. Yeah, we're old friends. She must be an ancient woman by now with hair as white as the feathers of a crow are black. Time the bringer finally ruins everything. And 2 short other excerpts. One from a letter I wrote to Russell telling him that I just adopted a boy and we just got him. So he's congratulating me. And he's saying, now you'll have a good argument for staying alive for the next 17 years or so. I'm still arguing for my own case. And the last excerpt I want to read is, I think every writer could relate to this. And in terms of, Peter's got some really good stuff about Russell thinking about writing, and this is the short one that I got here. And Russell says, I stand before an audience and wonder whose work I'm reading. Open books I've published with the same feeling. The act of writing is mysterious. The results are mysterious. So I leave Russell and his mystery. Thanks.
Thanks, Gian. Very much appreciated. And thank you again, everybody. This was a wonderful tribute to Russell Edson. Thank you, Nin, Cassandra, Maxine, Chard, Denise, Jeff, Peter, of course, for organizing it, Mary and John. Yeah, this has been absolutely wonderful. I'm going to hand over this portion of the show to my co-host, Jonathan Penton, who's going to guide the open mic tonight.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, that was a fantastic feature. I really appreciate that. It was great to be however minimally a part of this. Yeah, wonderful set of stories, wonderful poems, great stuff all around. So our open mic filled up almost immediately 2 weeks ago as we ended our last show. 4 people signed up immediately, and I think only one of them actually came. I see Ilaria Pass isn't here. Judy Barrett and Michael Sindler, if you're here under a different name, hit us up in the chat. And otherwise we will hear from Lydia, and maybe we'll ask a couple regulars to read a poem. Let's see, I know Roger wanted to read one, and I know Bob Heeman did. So let's hear from Lydia. Sorry, Lydia, I'm finding your name. There we go. Lydia, are you there?
Okay. My mother used to say that some people drown in a glass of water, and some people do. She said it a lot. She did it a lot. She didn't say it about herself. She said it about us. She said it when she was feeling overwhelmed. We drowned a lot in glasses of water she poured. My mother used to claim that now the birds want to be the hunters. She used to say that now the birds want to shoot the hunters. She said it a lot. And what bird wouldn't want to? She said it about us. She said it when she was feeling overwhelmed. And some birds do want to shoot the hunters. We tried to pick up the guns, but they were too heavy.
Wonderful, Lydia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So like I say, we don't have the other people who signed up, but Bob was reaching out to me asking to read. Bob Heeman, do you have something to read tonight?
Yes, I do. This has been a wonderful event. I've so enjoyed it. In the desert, the magician drew from the sand an army 100,000 strong to drive from within the city wall the invading Mongol horde. He was our savior. Once again, we were able to go on about our lives beneath the caliph's protective eye. The Mongols fled across the sands and did not return. Weeks passed and we became more and more aware of the warriors who packed the streets and markets and alleys where before they had not walked. Somehow we had assumed they would be gone as quickly as they appeared, but still they moved within our midst. Whether the magician was unable to send them back or merely unwilling, we could not tell. But it did not matter, they still remained, the city swollen to 3 times its normal size. The newcomers were just like us. They prayed and dined and smoked with us. They knew the same songs and tales our people always knew. Soon it became difficult to recognize them at all. The desert surrounding us remained as impenetrable as before. Often we stopped at its edge to wonder how the Mongols were ever able to stage their strange invasion. Now every week the market stalls grow emptier. Food and goods became scarcer every day. Our poor methods of production just can't keep up with so many. The caliph has not been seen for weeks and no one knows where the magician is gone. There are those among us who think perhaps this has all been a dream, a vision conjured by the magician to explain why the caliph can no longer provide us with our basic needs. They believe that in reality, we are the same number that we have always been, just more aware of each other as the things that enable us to live seem increasingly to be in short supply. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much. It's always good to hear you read. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
All right, Michael Sindler has arrived. He said he was looking.
Yeah, I finally made it. With the holiday coming up, I wanted to do something that I thought was somewhat appropriate. There's a great painter named Mark Bradford, who I think is absolutely incredible. This is a piece I was lucky enough to read at the opening of his exhibition here in Denver a few years ago. It's called Shade for Mark Bradford. What was is not what is. Layers pasted and torn back like the scar tissue that never heals, the black skin, resilient yet aching from endless abuse, the cry of pain reaching out to cover the landscapes, broken, cracked, but indelible, even in the face of attempts to obliterate. The charred skin of bodies lynched and left to rot showed these marks, the wild and vicious slashes of floggings and canings as well. And still, no matter how much is torn away, how intense the attempt to obliterate, to desecrate and destroy, there remain patches of proud, pure black, stubbornly holding fast to the canvas of history, refusing to be negated, no matter how denigrated, how dismissed, how denatured, no matter how powerful the tug of forces straining to enlarge them and to pull them from the story, to rip out native tongues and leave a dark pool of silence. But within these dark, empty, inky depths, this black swamp of memory, a song vibrates, carried over burnt loam hills on fragile wings, wispy shadows lacing land with homespun pattern, lending definition and dignity. Anchoring chords of hope, notes of defiance, and resonating tones of resilient spirit. A song of knowledge decrying the dormant within this world of thin and brittle, pasty and paltry, faded and fading, damned and doomed prejudice, lying in wait in the cool shadow of shade, the soft, pure richness of black will persevere. Okay, thank y'all.
Thank you, Michael. That was great ekphrasis. What was the artist's name again?
He's Mark Bradford. He's out of LA. Actually, I think right now his stuff might be selling for more than any other painter alive right now. I know it's like in the multi-millions, but it's really interesting. He actually paints, but he doesn't really tend to use paint. I don't want to waste y'all's time trying to explain. Look him up.
Well, thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
So before our reading, I was hearing from our friend Roger Kamenetz, who's going to be featured on March the 13th. He was telling me about how Russell Edson influenced him. So Roger, would you like to read something?
Okay. Hi, everyone. really enjoyed learning so much about Russell Edson from so many of you who knew him. And I heard him read once that thing that I think Peter said he'll never go to AWP, but it was in New York, and he gave a wonderful reading. I think it was in 1999. I was going to read one by me, but I think I'll read this because I happened to find this book called A Roof with Some Clouds Behind It by Russell Edson. And it seems to be a fairly, I don't know, the experts will know, but it seems pretty rare book. It printed 350 copies. Well, maybe that's a lot for a poetry book. Anyway, I was thinking about what, especially what Maxine said that touched me so much about deflation and inflation having to do with power relationships. And I don't know how early this poem is. It was published in the book was published in the booklet was published in 1975. It's called The Cottage in the Wood by Russell Edson. He has built himself a cottage in a wood, near where the insect rubs its wings in song. Yet, without measure or proper sense of scale, he has made the cottage too small. He realizes this when only his hand will fit through the door. He tries the stairs to the second story with his fingers, but his arm wedges in the entrance. He wonders how he will cook his dinner. He might get his fingers through the window, but the stove's too tiny to cook enough food. He shall also lie unsheltered, even though a bed with its covers turned down waits for him in one of the tiny bedrooms. He lies down, holding the cottage in his arms, listening to the insect that rubs its wings for song. So that's a really nice one, I think, by Russell Edson. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Well, we've had 3 more people request to read tonight, and I think we need to go ahead and cut it off. So Big Mike and Oz Hardwick and Pamela, I don't know your last name. If you care to come in 2 weeks, we'll be sure and get you in for the open mic. And yeah, what a great feature. It was a real pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in and the celebration of Russell Edson's work. And thank you, Nin, Cassandra, Maxine, Chard, Denise, Jeff, Peter, Mary, and Gian for what a fantastic performance. And yeah, next week we have an exciting feature, which will be 3 New Zealand poets, Ian Britton, Lisa Samuels, and Jen Crawford, and they will be live 5 p.m. EST, USA. I think for some of them it's going to be different times, but let's listen. Let's see what the New Zealanders have to say. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for paying attention to this amazing language spectrum that we get to experience on Lit Balm, and hope to see you next time in New Zealand. Poetry and love. Good night.
Good night, everybody.